By the late 1970s, Chicago was still powerful, still moving, still producing, still holding its place as one of America's major cities. But beneath that strength, something had begun to shift. Not in a way that stopped the city, but in a way that changed how it functioned. Industry was no longer as secure as it once felt. Some factories slowed, others began to close. The massive systems that had supported generations of workers were still present, but they no longer carried the same certainty. At the same time, population patterns were beginning to change. Families moved outward to the suburbs, taking stability and resources with them. The city remained full, but it no longer felt as anchored. Crime was becoming more visible, shaping how people thought about certain neighborhoods and, increasingly, the city as a whole. It didn't define Chicago yet, but it added to a growing sense that the city was becoming more complicated, more divided. And yet, Chicago was different from other industrial cities. It didn't rely on just one industry. It had finance, business, transportation, and infrastructure that extended beyond manufacturing. That diversity gave it a kind of resilience, a sense that even if one part of the system weakened, the city as a whole would continue. So Chicago entered the 1980s, not in collapse, but in transition. It still had power, still had momentum, but the direction was no longer as clear. The city was too large, too layered, and too complex to fall apart quickly, but also too changed to remain the same. For those living through it, the shift wasn't always obvious. Life continued. The train still ran. Downtown stayed active. Neighborhoods held their routines, but there was a growing awareness, quiet but persistent, that Chicago was entering a different phase, one that would reshape what the city was and who it was for. As Chicago moved into the 1980s, the change became clearer in the places that had once defined its strength. The city was still working, still producing, but the kind of work it relied on was beginning to shift. The industrial backbone that had supported generations, steel mills, factories, stockyards, was no longer as stable as it once felt. On the south side, steel production began to decline. Plants that had employed thousands slowed down or shut their doors entirely. The work didn't disappear overnight, but it faded in a way that forced people to adjust. Jobs that once felt permanent became uncertain. Entire communities that had been built around those industries felt the impact. The Union stockyards, once central to Chicago's identity, had already closed by the early 1970s, signaling a larger change that was now continuing across the city. The era of Chicago as a dominant industrial powerhouse was coming to an end, not through a single event, but through a gradual shift that touched multiple sectors at once. At the same time, another version of the city was growing. Downtown, the Loop, became more important, not less. Finance, corporate offices, and service-based industries expanded, bringing a different kind of opportunity. The city began to lean into business, banking, and professional services, creating a new economic center that looked very different from the factory floors. But the transition wasn't equal. The jobs replacing industrial work didn't always reach the same neighborhoods or the same people. Skills didn't always transfer. Opportunities didn't always align. While some parts of Chicago adapted and even grew stronger, others were left behind, still tied to an economy that was disappearing. Chicago didn't stop working, it just started working differently. The shift from blue-collar industry to white-collar opportunity gave the city resilience, but it also created new divides. What had once been a shared economic foundation was becoming something more uneven. more fragmented and harder to navigate. As the 1980s progressed, Chicago didn't empty out the way some industrial cities did, but it did begin to thin. Population decline came slowly, spread across years rather than moments, but its effects were visible. Families moved outward to suburbs across Cook County and beyond, drawn by space, schools, and the promise of stability away from neighborhoods that were starting to change. White flight accelerated patterns that had already been forming for decades. As residents left, the city's demographic balance shifted, and with it came changes in investment, opportunity, and infrastructure. Entire sections of Chicago, particularly on the south and west sides, began to feel the weight of disinvestment. Neighborhoods that had once been stable and tightly connected started to fragment. Some remained strong, held together by long-standing community ties and economic resilience. Others declined quickly, losing businesses, population, and the sense of consistency that had once defined daily life. Segregation, already deeply embedded, became even more pronounced. Chicago developed some of the most visible economic and racial divides in the country. Where you lived determined access to jobs, to schools, to safety, to opportunity. The city didn't lose its neighborhoods, but the distance between them grew wider in every way that mattered. The contrast became part of Chicago's identity. One neighborhood could feel stable and active, while another, just miles away, struggled with abandonment and lack of resources. The city remained connected by infrastructure, trains, roads, systems, but socially and economically, it became more divided. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Chicago was no longer a single experience. It was multiple realities existing side by side, shaped by history, movement, and the uneven effects of change. As Chicago moved deeper into the 1980s and 1990s, the city entered a period defined less by transition and more by contrast. Some parts of Chicago adapted and grew stronger, while others faced increasing pressure from unemployment, disinvestment, and instability. The result was a city that felt different depending on where you stood. Crime became a central part of Chicago's national image. Violence, particularly in certain South and West Side neighborhoods, drew attention and shaped perception. For residents in those areas, it wasn't just a headline. It was part of daily life, something that influenced movement, routines, and decisions. For others, it was something they heard about, but didn't experience in the same way. Gang activity became more visible during this time, concentrated in specific communities, already dealing with limited resources and opportunity. Public housing developments, once built to provide stability, increasingly became associated with the city's struggles. Places like Cabrini Green and the Robert Taylor homes came to symbolize a system under strain. At the same time, other parts of Chicago remained active and even expanded. Downtown continued to grow as a business and cultural center. The North Side maintained stability, and in some areas saw new investment. The contrast between these areas and struggling neighborhoods became sharper, more defined. Residents adapted to this reality. Life in Chicago required awareness, knowing where you were, when to move, and how to navigate a city that no longer felt uniform. Communities developed their own systems of resilience, finding ways to function within the conditions they faced. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Chicago had developed a dual identity. On one side, it was a global city: business, culture, architecture, and growth. On the other, it remained a place where certain neighborhoods continued to struggle with the long-term effects of economic and social change. By the early 2000s, Chicago had moved beyond decline into something more complex, a city rebuilding itself, but not in a way that felt equal or complete. The collapse that defined other industrial cities never fully took hold here. Instead, Chicago reshaped itself piece by piece, leaning into new strengths while still carrying the weight of what had been lost. Downtown saw the most visible change. Investment returned. Skyscrapers filled with corporate offices. Tourism grew. The Loop and surrounding areas became stronger, more modern, more connected to a global economy that no longer depended on factories the way it once had. Chicago reestablished itself as a major city, not through industry, but through business, finance, and culture. At the same time, neighborhoods began to change in new ways. Areas like Wicker Park, Logan Square, and the near North Side saw reinvestment and rising property values. New residents moved in, businesses followed, and entire sections of the city took on a different identity. What had once been working-class neighborhoods began to transform, but the recovery was never even. Many communities on the south and west sides continued to face the same challenges that had taken hold decades earlier. Limited investment, fewer opportunities, and the long-term effects of disinvestment. The divide that had formed in the late 20th century didn't disappear. It became part of the city's structure. Chicago didn't collapse like other Rust Belt cities, but it didn't stay the same either. It evolved. It adapted. It became something more layered, more global, but also more divided. A city that learned how to survive change, even if that change came unevenly. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe for more stories about American cities, their rise, their fall, and what they've become today. And let me know in the comments, what city should we explore next?